And welcome everybody to the Agronomist. A little bit of host switcheroo on everybody tonight. Lindsay Smith, your usual host, is having some internet issues, but myself, Shaun Haney, I am here and looking forward to tonight's discussion. We're talking insect invasion tonight. This is going to be a lot of fun. Really, really looking forward to it. So, if you want to remind you that you can't get CCA credits for watching the Agronomist, and if you sign up for our Agronomist email, two things happen. One, we notify you that we're going to be going on the air, and here's what tonight's topic is. Or what happens the next day, or I should say, the next day, we email you that now you can qualify for your credits. So encourage you to do that. If you have any questions about it and you have trouble doing it, send me an email, shaney@realagriculture.com. And we've already got people chiming in there on the chat. Great to see everybody. Hope everybody's making out okay. And really looking forward to tonight's discussion all about insects. As you can see, I am broadcasting from my home studio and not over at the Real Ag Studios on the west side of Lethbridge. But we're going to have a lot of fun tonight and really looking forward to it. Let's bring in tonight's panelists. We've got Jennifer Otani from Beaverlodge, Alberta. Jennifer, how's it going?
Good. Hoping the internet connection stays viable through this.
Well, it looks and sounds pretty good. So all systems go here off the hop. Also joining us is Steph Kowalski of the Agromart Group. Hey, Steph, how are you?
Hey, good. How are you, Shaun?
Hey, I'm doing fantastic. I wasn't planning on being here, but here we are. So, Jennifer, let's start with you. A dry year on a good part of the prairies. I think the northern half not doing too badly. What is this like? How much does the dryness allow us to predict insect levels?
Oh, that is such a good question. I think one of the things weather-wise is that we know that temperature and moisture are super important for insects. Temperature in particular really helps drive development because these insects are depending on external temperatures to help their metabolic processes, right? The one thing I think we want to even step back further is that we've had a pretty mild winter. I think all of us were very grateful for that. Nice to be outside and not in the -40 all winter. But for some of our insects that overwinter, I think the general rule is that a milder winter often is making things better for some of those overwintering insects to survive into the spring. So all in all, we've had a pretty mild winter. I think for most parts of the prairies, we were relatively maybe a bit earlier with our spring weather. And as you're pointing out, it is now pretty warm and now in some areas pretty dry. So I think what we're starting to see with some of the insect modeling that comes out of Ag Canada, out of Saskatoon, that we run into the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network's outputs, we're starting to see that some of those temperatures are really pushing some of the insect development stages a little quicker to appear, and then they're actually progressing a little faster. So that's not necessarily great news on the front of insects.
And Steph, same thing you're finding in Ontario?
Yeah, a lot of the province was quite dry up until some recent rainfalls, and there still are a lot of dry pockets that definitely puts us on the kind of front side edge of being aware for certain bugs in our neck of the woods. Some areas have got some rainfall and relief, but that just advances the crops even further. So meaning we got to watch even closer as there's going to be soybeans hitting reproductive stages here soon. That is crazy to think about, but even, puts the pressure on to be watching that much closer.
Yeah, and Steph, I got to apologize to you. I said Kowalski, but it's Berlett.
No worries.
I apologize for that.
No worries. Yeah, I got married last year. Yeah, changed the name, bit the bullet. Yeah.
There you go. Well, belated congratulations. I apologize for the mix-up at the beginning. So, Jennifer, you mentioned the Pest Monitoring Network. A lot of growers hear that. Briefly here, just explain what that is.
Yeah, so the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network's been active for almost 30, 35 years, I think. And essentially, it brings together federal, provincial, and even some of our university researchers that are working on field crop protection and specifically entomology. So, these are people with Ag Canada, the provincial entomologists, and of course, some of our people at the university. So the network really brings together a lot of expertise, a lot of people who are on the ground doing field crop protection, especially with entomology. And I think one of the big things in terms of the network is really starting to look at the prairie-wide forecast maps, looking at the risk and distribution maps. But through the growing season, what is really important is that the Prairie Pest Monitoring Network also is starting to generate weekly updates. So that's putting environmental data that's updated on a day-to-day basis. We generate a weekly update, but essentially we're kind of looking at predictive models for the various economic pests on the prairies that would affect our field crops and looking at how they're developing. And the key thing there is that we're really trying to help growers and agrologists time some of their scouting. Because as we understand, most of our insects, it's not like every life stage causes damage, thankfully. Many of them are very specific stages. And so, by looking at some of the predictive models, we're hoping to help people time their in-field scouting and to also then have a better sense of what kind of risk they might be facing. And then ultimately, what we're really hoping is they're actually applying some thresholds and actually making some really viable pest management decisions that will help them with their productivity, but also help all of those other insects that are out there. Because as we now know, it's more than just pests.
Yeah. Steph, similar sort of monitoring network in Ontario?
Yeah, we're so lucky to have Tracy Bowdy, managing the input on the Ontario front from not only that, just Eastern Canada and the northwestern states or northeastern states, sorry, into Michigan, which is super important because a lot of our storm systems come through there, which bring bugs and all the fun stuff with them. So hats off to Tracy for getting us involved in that Eastern Canada wide initiative, similar exactly to that prairie system.
Jennifer, I know you mentioned the temperature earlier. But I just want to circle back to that because a lot of times we talk about when we're trying to control weeds, we talk about temperature as it applies to, yeah, we get over that 28 degrees, 30 degrees, and we may have some challenges. Review the temperature aspect from an insect perspective and whether or not that's a good time to be scouting, thinking about control, all those kinds of things.
Yeah, so the key thing with most of our insect pests is that there are some good times of days, and just focusing on really trying to assess the actual damaging stage. That's the key thing. So there are some insect pests where you actually want to go really early in the morning or at dusk. Cutworms is a really good example. That group is typically a lot easier to scout because they come above ground. Some of our climbing cutworms, at least, and so you can assess them. Things like flea beetles, very active during the day, but also really hard to count. Thankfully, we're looking at defoliation instead of actual counting those tiny, tiny flea beetles that move very quickly. And then, something like Lygus, which actually really likes really nice weather. It's one of my favorite insect pests because I usually can't monitor when it's pouring rain. But, there is time of day and temperature that can really have an impact on scouting. So, this is also where growers do want to be a little bit aware of the fact that some of these insect pests, time of day matters. And certainly there are times in the season where there are some critical windows. I think right now, for most of us on the prairies, we're kind of hoping that flea beetles are done. We're kind of tailing end on the cutworm species. Usually this is when we stop seeing wireworm activity in the same way that we would like really early in the spring. But now we're also gearing up because we're looking at some other insect pests, like needing to do some infield scouting for diamondback moth. Armyworm will be not too far behind, and then wheat midge. So there's a lot of things through the season that we really want to try and scout and prioritize on our list. But you're right, time of day can matter for some of them.
Yeah, Steph, as an agronomist, do you enjoy scouting for insects or like because I think it's such a well, essentially it is a moving target in so many ways. But what do you think about it from the agronomist standpoint?
Actually, that's funny you asked that, Sean, because literally as we were going through some of those bugs there, I was trying to think of what's worse, like scouting canola, like, the big, thick canola, or scouting, Western bean, cutworm, and corn. I still think canola wins for being hands down, like, yeah, that's when the traps can do the work for you, that's always a lot more fun. But yeah, I mean, Yeah, I gotta say, I am a bit of a girly girl. I don't like scouting for bugs. I get, I'm probably the worst agronomist for that, but especially when it's large larvae. Like I don't mind little bugs, but the larvae just are gross, man.
Well, and Jennifer mentioned wireworms, but there's one where it's like it's difficult. Like
Yeah.
it's
Yeah,
at least with grasshoppers, you know they're there because
yeah,
you got grasshopper guts all over the windshield of the truck. That's the first
yeah,
indicator, right? But from a wireworm, that's an example where we really got to work for it. Like, and we see the damage. And a lot of times I think a lot of people misdiagnose the damage. They think it's other things because the wireworm is so hard to find and spot. And you kind of need some of that, professional sort of advice that the two of you would provide. But on your own, it can be a real challenge for the grower. So insects are really one where, and I think people become sort of, and maybe Steph, you tell me if I'm right, but people become where you have the insects you deal with all the time as the agronomist. And
yeah.
so that's kind of your wheelhouse, but there's always new challenges and new movements in that really present a lot of challenges when you're trying to provide advice to the grower. Is that how you feel?
Yeah, totally. Like especially some of these pests when from a like an entomology standpoint, they're not following their traditional, growth stages and life cycles and like okay, this is where they should be and they're not and they're, extended diapause, things like that are just completely game changers and well, normally you could track this life cycle and when they throw you a curveball and or, different growth stages, it really messes with you.
Well, one of the insects to scout that it's troublesome, and Jennifer, you put it. You had a word for it. We're going to watch a video on aphid scouting with Tracy Bowdy, and you mentioned you can't count them, but you had a word for. Did you not say something? What you classify that as? Where you just kind of look at defoliation? Is that what you said?
Yeah, so I mean, for many of our insect pests, one of the big ways that we figure out what kind of impact or measure their populations or impact would be not just counting insects, but in the other case with flea beetles. Good example. You're actually looking at levels of defoliation.
Hmm.
Pea leaf weevil is another good indication. And part of it is, I think, initially when people started to look at some of these insect pests, they quickly discovered that the adults are, first of all, hard to find and hard to count because they are either, like with flea beetles, they move so much and they're small, or with pea leaf weevil, they are really hiding during the day. So you have to look at some of the strategies and some of the other characteristics then that help you build some relationships in so that you can look at defoliation and then start to hopefully predict what kind of yield impact they're going to have. So, this is where we as researchers, we have a lot of work to do. But now we can see that these economic thresholds, that's exactly what they are. They're looking at ways to count or estimate an insect population and start to predict their impact on yield. And, this is the key thing. I think it sounds complicated, but really it's all about knowing what's in your field and starting to make a good prediction on how to manage it. So, yeah, it's pretty tough. It is funny to hear you guys talking about insects because exactly some of the things that Steph was just describing, those are exactly the same things that are actually pretty exciting to people like me who like to do that research. So I don't want to sound like a total geek, but like when you're talking about how challenging it is, or and it is tough. I'm not going to lie. There's some insects that I just hate. I really loathe because they're just a lot of work to get data and hard data to get, right?
Okay, okay. When you said that,
tough.
okay, let's go to that then. You said it. I'll ask it.
Okay.
What's the insect you loathe the most then?
Well, wireworms is super tough, but I'm going to tell you, I've had a lot of experience with different cutworm species, and they are such a huge challenge. They're also really fun to work with because, first of all, they're one of those insects where you think you might know what's going on, and then it's not what you think. You
Hmm.
start to have to dig, you have to look for them. They're not necessarily up on the foliage. We've had some real trouble with some of our subterranean species that are really hard to estimate. But some of those really difficult species have also turned out to have some fantastic parasitoid complexes that attack them. So they've
Hmm.
actually been pretty exciting to actually study because they're actually There's just so much going on in fields, and I think that still today is what really excites me about entomology and field crops.
I love a
Total
good
nerd.
parasitoid story. I love a good parasitoid story. There's like,
Yeah.
and nobody can tell it like Tyler Wist. He's like, he talks about it like it's some sort of like sci-fi movie that is happening, and the bugs
Yeah.
are like 6 feet tall, and they're trying to take over the world. Steph, what's the insect you loathe the most?
Well, I think there was a comment earlier about how much I love scouting for Western bean cutworm, and I think Warren, with it, you could pick up on the sarcasm there, because him and I were messaging there last summer when I was trying to scout for it, and I'm just, I hate it. I hate it, and it ties in because the larvae, by the time we find them, are so big and disgusting, and they change their flight patterns on us, and they drive me nuts. And I don't know, Jennifer
Oh.
probably would find it super exciting if she was in Ontario.
It's
Yeah.
all good. It's all good. Okay, let's watch our first clip. This is a clip with Tracy Bowdy. She's the pest specialist with Omafra, and she's talking about scouting for soybean aphids. Let's cue the clip, Jay, and let's watch it.
One thing that's not so good is the soybean crop. It's backward, it's delayed. I think we're going to get there, but we had a slow start, and I'm interested in what that means for soybean aphids. And maybe we'll start this conversation with wheat and cereals. You saw a lot of cereal aphids this spring.
Yep, it was conducive to the aphids this spring, which might be good. There might be natural enemies that move from the cereal crop into the soybean crop, but the soybeans, even though they're starting to flower, there's not as much canopy. So it doesn't take as many aphids per plant. You have to almost lower it closer to the threshold that we're concerned with, the 250 aphids per plant, because the crop is not as lush and vigor as it usually is.
So Trace, we're looking at, again, a late crop, but I think aphids could be an issue.
Yep.
People need to scout, and I want to get some scouting tips from you. And the first thing you do, you always bring your phone.
Yes.
And the Aphid Advisor.
Yes, so the Aphid Advisor app, which is free, developed with University of Guelph, helps guide you through whether you need to spray or if there's enough natural enemies that you could wait or don't spray at all. So I think it's really important. This is the kind of year where you may not want to put a lot of inputs on a crop that may not yield as much anyway, but it still requires protection because it's so short, and it's got a long ways to go before you're harvesting. So best to do the guidance of the app to see what it's telling you.
Yeah, so you're going to get out there, you're going to take some shots and do some calculations, because the app does that for you, right?
Yep, so you select, it's based for the R stages. So once you're in R stage, the flowering, first flower or beyond, you go into it, you tell it what the crop stage is you're in, then the number of aphids you're seeing on each plant that you monitor for, and then the number of different natural enemies you see. Ladybugs being the most important. They are the most ferocious or hungry, but the others also play a role. And we may see, with more humidity, some of the entomopathogens and other things come in, especially because there's been aphids on cereals to help build up that natural enemy population.
Right, so you got some results, you're at threshold,
Yep.
What do you need to do?
So then if that's the case, then you spray. There's lots of options. You just have to keep in mind a couple things. A few of the products on their label state you can't apply during a flowering crop. So pay attention to which one you choose. But also, again, in this kind of heat that we're having, a pyrethroid really can't be sprayed in the heat of the day. So do it in the evening. Do it at night when you're more likely to get better efficacy, as long as there's no inversion, There's been a lot of inversions lately. You don't want to see that leave the field and go elsewhere.
Great stuff. And of course, if you have any questions for our panelists, make sure you comment whether you're watching on Twitter, YouTube, or Facebook. Love questions from the audience. Challenge our panel a little bit. Steph, any thoughts on the soybean aphid this year?
Yeah, for sure. There's already been a few documented cases throughout throughout the province here, and not surprising given how dry we started out early on. Tracy highlights a lot of the key points in that video, but watching now more than ever as we get into these reproductive stages, I guess, is we've kind of been, on establishment and crop establishment, and now we're onto weed control. But we've kind of got to shift into watching for these pests as we go into the more susceptible growth stages in the coming weeks.
And is it today on Real Ag Radio? Peter Johnson was on with me, and we were talking about aphids in oats, and that happens first. Is that correct?
Yeah, there's a few different species of hosts for aphids, right? So lots of grass species, and oats being one of them. Hay, we cut hay and they'll move around, and tree lines, overwintering in tree lines and things like that. So they're all over out there. We got to always be on our watch for them.
Well, that's my kind of app. That basically I look at a picture and I compare it to what I'm seeing in the field, and then I know if I got a spray or not. Because who the heck wants to count like 200 aphids on a plant?
Well, it's really handy. And even I was going to ask Jennifer when she was talking about the biggest thing I find, the aphids aren't defoliators; they're sucking pests, so they suck the sap, right? But Jennifer, the pest she was talking about more defoliate, and I find a lot of times we don't have a good way to gauge defoliation, and we look at defoliation and we panic and go, oh my god, they're eating the leaves. But really, when you put it on the scale, it's only 5 to 10% defoliation. So we don't really deal with a lot of defoliators in Ontario as much. In soybeans, it'd be oh gosh, where's Peter? Bean leaf beetle. There are defoliators in soybeans, but it's handy to have a guide to show you what percentage. And that aphid app is a good example to take a picture and make it easy to show, what's your rough count, what's your numbers at, because it looks worse a lot of the times than it actually is.
Yeah, it's totally true. I think with a lot of defoliation, it's really funny how our human eyes will, I think, typically overestimate. And I think part of it is that we're really anxious to do stuff, and when we see leaf missing, it's always it triggers panic in a lot of us, right? But it's true, having a visual guide is a really big help. With flea beetles in particular, I know that there's been work, and I think there is work it's underway right now, where they're looking at trying to actually get the visual camera, take a picture, it starts to calculate. And this has been one of the things that I think they've wanted to do with flea beetles for decades, literally, but now the technology is catching up, because it's really hard. These small cotyledons are a real challenge to measure. But yeah, what we typically are telling people when they go scouting is take a guide. And for flea beetles, there are some really nice visual estimates of percent defoliation. And to have that alongside so that you're looking at a plant, looking at the guide, and kind of working together to kind of get yourself down to it. Because, if you're not doing it very often, it's tough to estimate. And I think we're going to start to see more of those apps that have some of these visual capacities to measure that leaf area. I think one of the challenges will still be, you'll still have to figure out and do some of the agronomy, because not all crops are doing well, or you're going to have to really start to weigh the weather and the growing conditions too. And that's where technology is maybe going to be held up. But things are coming where they will be able to visually map how much is gone. And I think those are great things, because like you say, those are tough things to do.
Are there any beneficials to tackle soybean aphids?
I'm going to defer to
yeah, Tracy mentioned them there in the video, but ladybugs are our friends, and actually they're beneficials, and they feed on the ladybugs, so they help keep the numbers in check a lot more than we think. So that's where practicing IPM comes in hugely, because they can keep those numbers actually in check and balance really, really well sometimes if the pressures aren't crazy high. And then another thing, when I look at ladybugs, is they're my tip-off for aphids. Like if I'm in a field and I find ladybugs, I'm looking for aphids right away, because they're my sign, generally, and they're a lot easier to spot.
Just to divert here for a second, we had a question from Logan, and he heard us talking about parasitoids. He says, are there any natural predators, parasitoids of wireworms? We've seen major damage here in Western Manitoba this spring. Jennifer?
Yeah, so, I haven't done work with parasitoids and wireworms. I have actually no doubt that there's probably something out there, because for every insect there seems to be something that does attack it. But in terms of predators, there will actually be other insects. So, a good example will be some of our ground beetles. And in fact, the ground beetle larvae are particularly voracious and would actually start to inhabit the same kind of niche, if you will, or the same area as what our wireworm larvae would. And then there are, and when we talk about ground beetles, lots of different species, kind of depends on how that field crop is managed. But again, I'm really glad to hear people talking about that, because we now are understanding a lot more about some of these pest populations, and that they are being regulated by some of these natural enemies. So, I mean, the short answer is yes, there are other things attacking wireworms. So, don't feel like you're all on your own. There are other things out there. It's just that wireworms also, it's a huge complex, several species, and no one species is in the same field ever, it seems. And you can have 2 or 3 species. So, wireworms are such a complicated issue. I'm super excited because there's going to be a new guide that will be coming out, we hope, later this field season, but in time for next field season, that will be in English. And I don't know if any of you are speaking French, of course, but Quebec has already published that wireworm field guide, and it is an amazing resource. Pictures of different wireworm species, showing some distribution maps. There's a tremendous amount of work going into wireworms right now, and it's actually a super exciting time, because one of the things that's also being developed is pheromones for some of these wireworm species. So, those bait balls that we talk about putting out for wireworms that are an absolute challenge, I don't manage to get them to work either any better than anybody else. But, pheromones are looking like there's a real place for them, and it's looking like some excellent work out of Wim van Herk, and Haley Catton is working with that. It's so promising and really exciting. So, hang in there.
Sometimes in the comment stream, I don't get the context of what point they're answering, but Jason Vogt says larvae of the stiletto fly called thrivid. What is that in reference to, Jennifer? Do you know?
I'm just going to go looking for it here. So I'm just looking for it. How far down should I be looking?
I don't know.
There it is. Oh,
yeah.
it's the family name he's typed. Wow. Okay, so Jason actually knows. He's giving me some family names. So stiletto fly larvae. It's been problematic, because here's the other thing. So when we talked about scouting for cutworms, one of the first things that we also realize is there's a whole bunch of other stuff that can be in the soil feeding on that kind of soil level plant material. So stiletto fly larvae are another thing that we can find, along with wireworms and cutworms, and they're a real challenge. Where I've kind of come into stiletto fly is where it's been in some of our turfs, and that's a larvae that can cause a huge amount of damage. So yeah, there's lots of things that can be in the soil lurking around in there. I want to also emphasize some of these things that you find in the soil are not necessarily pests. People dig things up and they bring stuff and the plant's not doing well. So their first thing is, what is this? It's killing my plant. And sometimes, surprisingly, what's in the plant is not necessarily the pest. They're moving in to feed on dead plant material. So, just a key thing, not everything you dig up is bad. We really want to emphasize that too. But I think he's just maybe, I don't know if he's had problems with them or with the context.
There is that habit, you're out there sweeping canola and you got a bunch of stuff in your net. You're like, you know what? I don't know what all this is, but there's a lot of bugs. Steph, I got to go spray. It's kind of like the human reaction. Jennifer makes a good point there.
It's a huge thing. And in fact, the Field Heroes initiative, which I think we've talked about, and I think you've promoted too on Real Ag, the Field Heroes initiative actually even has an infographic. Like, when you have a sweep net, consider or know that this proportion of what's in that sweep net in canola at full flower, probably only about 10% of what's in there might be a pest. The rest is going to be stuff that's just passing through, other things that are pollinating. There's just so much stuff that comes to flowering crops, and we have to remember that. And that's a big key point when we're trying to ask people to manage it. Because it's not just about managing one pest. It's that you've got a huge, big land area that is presenting nectar and pollen. So of course we're going to get a lot of other things in there. And some of those things are very beneficial to that crop, whether it's soybeans, whether it's canola, all of our big seed crops that do all of that flowering. There's a lot of crazy things that can be in there, and that's kind of good.
Jason commented that he was told that the thurvid can feed on wireworms. So that's what he was
Oh,
making that
okay.
comment.
Yeah, and you know what? Totally possible. I have not done a lot with wireworms other than we've been doing a tremendous amount of pitfall trapping. So we haven't been pulling wireworms apart too often, but we've been counting larvae and looking at species diversity. And so, of course, I'm based in the Peace River region. So one of the cool things with our work, we are working with Wim van Herk out of Agassiz. What we're trying to do is actually figure out what species are in some of our more northerly crops. Are some of those introduced European pest species that are such a huge problem in potatoes and other parts of Canada and other vegetable crops? Are they even up here? And what we're starting to find out is we've got some pretty distinct species. We've also got some wireworm species that are actually moving into field crops simply because they're coming off of trees, which we have a few of. But these are really important questions in terms of species diversity, because as things start to warm up, as we start to get new cultivars moving into new regions, we are expecting to have more problems, not less. And some of our new cultivars are going to bring new pests, and that's just a fact of life.
Peter Johnson reminds me the baby alligators are the ladybug larvae. That is the beneficial. So Pete always making sure I'm in line. We got a question here, Steph, from Gord. He says, insect attack. Is that an indication that populations are out of balance, indication that crop is unhealthy, or just part of the natural population cycles, or is it just all the above?
Wow, that's a really good question. I mean, I would say it's a factor of all of them. I mean, we can pull apart specific examples to kind of feed each one. Like, soybeans with potash deficiency are way more likely to suffer an insect or an aphid infestation. So that's where we're going with the out of balance, unhealthy. Natural cycles. We're always going to have, like Jennifer was talking about, some of those wireworm species, they're always going to be naturally part of the biome. So how do you work and manage that together effectively? So it's kind of goes hand in hand. I would say, to a couple different factors there. That's a really, really good question.
Yeah, it is. It's your answer makes a lot of sense to me. That it's the ecosystem. It's all the stuff happening in the canopy, and it's all interacting. And I think a lot of times we sort of overlook that. We simplify it, and it's a very complex. No matter whether it's canola or soybeans, corn, wheat, whatever, we oversimplify what's happening, and it's a pretty complex ecosystem in there. Jennifer, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, well, I was just thinking too. I mean, this year we're dealing with some pretty hot, dry weather. And I think really what a lot of people need to remember is we've got plants that are under a lot of stress right now. And so it's not even just the fact that some of those are maybe more attractive to insects, it's the fact that they're way more vulnerable because they just can't tolerate a lot of feeding, whether it's defoliation or sucking insects. We've got a lot of acres that are really hoping for a lot of rain. And, there are some pest species where 2 inches of water can solve all of our problems. Not all of them, of course, is that easy to solve. But right now, there's just some really stressed crop acres out there. And, that's the problem too. Managing stressed crops is super tough because you're behind the 8 ball all the way for the rest of the crop year.
Yeah. Steph, just to be clear, what's the window that growers should be out in the field looking for soybean aphids? What's the timing on that?
Yeah, I mean, anytime we're putting boot prints in the field, be watching for these pests. But the reproductive stages. So once we get flowers on those soybeans, that's when we really got to be watching closely. Up until we get into that R5, where the beans are really finishing off. We've got to watch is when they're flowering. Like Jennifer mentioned, like you don't want to have any stress on those beans already. those crops, and then you add in, an aphid infestation, and that's when we're hurting yield, when we're hurting flowering, and we're hurting pod set, and all the reproductive stages. Yeah.
Yeah, Steph, I shared a story on Real Ag Radio a couple weeks ago where I remember growing up on the farm, and I think it was like a Friday. It had to do with grasshoppers, but the idea was that just because you scouted Friday doesn't mean the next time you're out in your field you're not paying attention, right? And I talked about how Friday went out there, no grasshoppers. Went back Monday and it was like 2 miles of 2 rows gone. Right. And a listener had sent me an email and talked about, hey, thanks, because I just did the same thing with flea beetles. Went out Friday, no activity, went Monday, and things are crazy. So this is just not one scout, Steph. This is like we're on the scouting wheel here right now.
Yeah. Yeah, and then you're watching the levels, right? Like I always joke that we have to babysit these fields, and we're going to live in these fields. If we get hot and dry through July and August, I just dread it, because I know I'm going to be in some of these fields 7, 8, 9 times, watching and monitoring those levels, because you have to, even once you've identified them, you got to track those levels and practice that IPM of when are we hitting that economic threshold, or are we even going to hit it? So you're basically babysitting these fields the whole summer. Yeah. Yay.
I got one more question here, and then we're gonna get to the next clip. Jennifer, Peter Johnson wants to know, could you give an example of a pest that 2 inches of rain will solve?
Yeah, as soon as I said it, I was like, oh, I'm going to get asked. Okay, so yeah, I shouldn't open my big yap, right? But, right now at this stage, I would say 2 inches of rain would be super for flea beetles and canola. Some areas just are really so drought stressed that plants are just sitting there. And really it's not that the 2 inches of rain is necessarily solving our insect problem as much as really just helping push plants get past vulnerable stages. And that's really what we want people to remember. For flea beetles right now, we're kind of at the tail end for most of the prairies. And I think some of the plants that are out there that are struggling, that are still coping with flea beetles, it's that they're really struggling because they're not growing. So there's a good example of one. I think in the chat, I was noticing someone was talking about grasshoppers might be solved. And actually, I'm going to tell you, at this point in the season, 2 inches of rain will not touch grasshoppers, unfortunately. We wanted rain back in April when it would saturate still all of those eggs that are sitting there. And unfortunately, we know that the grasshopper hatch is well underway on the prairies now. So 2 inches of rain for these little guys is not really going to be the end of the world, because they can kind of hunker down and they can actually move up on the canopy. And I think the big concern right now is that we're starting to see some really high populations of grasshoppers in some pockets of Manitoba and Saskatchewan. I'm not totally sure about the rest of Alberta, but one of the things we are worried about is that the forecast map had some pockets for grasshoppers on the prairies, but what we're seeing is, I think, really ideal spring conditions for the hatch to continue and to progress, and we're going to see some nice warm weather on the nymphs, and they're just going to start to really push through development stages, and that means they've got to get fuel for that. So unfortunately, we want crops to grow, and that's where the 2 inches of rain will definitely help, but there are definitely a few other insects that it's actually not going to touch. The other thing I should mention is right now we're a little bit worried about some pockets with wheat midge on the prairies, because there are definitely some pockets where we're seeing that they had ideal spring conditions for temperature, but also for precipitation. And unfortunately, some of those same areas were really coming out red on the annual forecast map for higher densities. So we're really waiting to see what happens with wheat midge too. But yeah, there are some pockets on the prairies where we're expecting more of the midge are ready to kind of come to the surface and pupate than we were originally hoping might happen this year. So there's an insect that actually did well with 2 inches of rain this spring, and some areas of the prairies got it.
Well, I promise we're going to get to the second clip. There's great questions coming in from the audience, so I'm gonna sneak one more in here. Question from Jenneth Johnson: what are the best tools available for farmers to use when making these tough insect decisions? Steph, what comes to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I'm with you, Shaun. The more visual apps and things like that we can have help out. some of these trapping networks and guidelines really help. Predictive modeling really help. But a lot of apps, just making sure they're relevant apps to your geography. I'm probably gonna try to look for a more Canadian or northern state focused app than I would for a southern state focused app. Just from a geographical standpoint. But as well as it's some of these guidelines and thresholds are pretty commonly known among agronomists and crop advisors. So certainly a text, a photo, that's where it's really handy to have a photo when guys are saying, I'm looking at, my field, and they send you a picture of it, and you can easily, help diagnose, whoa, that's a lot, I'm coming out, or, just, you're okay, sit tight, keep checking it type deal. So, your crop advisor is always a handy person to have from that.
That's actually what you said about the region where the app or the calculator was programmed is actually a really important thing. So, and I can't give insect examples, but I would imagine the thresholds could be different depending on the area of the crop, things like that. And so if the data set is from Arkansas, that may not fit in Saskatchewan. Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't, but the back end is driving it.
Yeah, it's not. I mean, I just always kind of watch that with model sets and data in general. We find, well, I was reading that in Kansas, and you're like, oh, we are very different than Kansas. We've got to make sure we're using relevant information to our geography. So I always kind of just keep that in the back of my mind when I'm checking out apps or downloading and looking at the crop types and things like that. I can usually tell a Western Canada app versus an Eastern Canada app and things like that. So.
Yeah. Okay, let's get to clip number 2. What do we got here? John Gosloski. We need a Western clip. So he's talking about diamondback moth and green worms. Jay, you ready? If you're ready to go, let's play clip number 2, and then we can discuss monitoring and things like that.
Okay, so the trap we have here is specifically for catching diamondback moth. So the way this trap works is there's a pheromone bait in here, and I'll pull the trap out and we can have a look. The bait is actually attracting the male moths. So here we go. Okay, so inside the trap there's a gray lure, and that lure has the same smell that the female releases at mating time to attract a mate. So the males will smell this, and they're confused. They think there's a female moth, so they will fly into the trap looking for the female, and there's the sticky insert that's been placed inside the trap. So a few male moths have fallen for the trap here. Next to my finger here, this is a diamondback moth. There's a diamondback moth here, and this one, the way it's landed, you can see the diamond pattern on the back quite well. This is why they call them diamondback moth. The adults have this set of about 3 white diamond-shaped patterns on the back. So that's what we use to identify them. So we've got a few of them. There's another one here, another one down here. There's about 4 or 5 on this sticky insert. And what we do is we will change these inserts weekly, and we look at the cumulative counts, and we use these numbers really to determine, is a region at high risk? And it's kind of like the same scenario as the Bertha armyworm traps. It's all done regionally. It doesn't mean a field is at high risk if we see high numbers, but it does mean regionally people want to be watching for them. Now, diamondback moth is a little different than Bertha armyworm. Bertha armyworm overwinters here, and we know more specifically when to put the traps up for Bertha armyworm and when we expect to see high counts. With diamondback moth, they blow in. They don't overwinter well in Manitoba at all. Some years we think we may get a few of them overwintering. A lot of years, probably most of what we have here gets killed off by the winter. So for us to have a problem, they need to blow in from the south almost on an annual basis. What these traps will do is tell us when a population has arrived and where in the province. This year, we're into July now, we've had high counts in the eastern part of Manitoba since May, really. So the eastern part of Manitoba, agronomists and farmers need to start scouting their fields looking for larvae. The moths don't feed on your crop. At the very best, they might feed a little bit on the nectar or dewdrops on the plant, but they're not the pest. The pest is the larva, small green caterpillars. That's what you need to be concerned about, and that's what you need to be monitoring for in the crop.
And so where would you find now, where do they lay their eggs, and where would you be looking for these larvae?
So I'll just put the insert down. To look for the larva, we recommend taking some plants. You can pull plants in maybe a foot square area, and you can shake them out over something. I've got a net here. We'll shake these plants over the net, and we'll see if there's any larvae that come out of them. Often people will do this over a vehicle hood or something in the field. So here's a green lacewing. This is a beneficial insect. Green lacewings love eating things like insect eggs, aphids, small insects. They've got a larva that it looks like it's alligator shaped but tiny. So little brown alligators that run around the crop looking for things like insect eggs. So things like lygus bug eggs, diamondback moth eggs, aphids if they can find them in here. Those are the type of things they like. Lacewings often come to lights at night, so people often see a lot of these. So if you start seeing a lot of these, that's a good thing. They're beneficial. So next to my finger here is a diamondback moth. This is a larva, and this one's actually fairly well grown. It's fairly large. Now, you can see it's dangling midair. Often when you disturb them on a plant, they will make this thread, and they drop from a thread to protect themselves, basically. In nature, if a parasite or something was trying to lay an egg on it, or a predator was getting too close, they drop on a thread, and they dangle. When they think they're safe, they go back up onto the leaf. So when you're shaking the leaves and the plants, and you see tiny green caterpillars like this dangling from the plants, that'll be diamondback moth. Now the other interesting behavior is if you disturb them, they do this really snaky dance. I call it the diamondback dance. So we'll put it on the container here, and I'll poke it a couple times, and we'll get it to do its diamondback dance. So you can see it kind of almost jumps, wiggles around, goes kind of snaky on us when we disturb it. So that's the diamondback dance. I'll get it into the center of the ring again, and we'll make it do another round of dancing. So that's another way you can tell, based on the behavior, that it's a diamondback moth. Other green caterpillars in canola won't do that. Bertha armyworm, the stages that are green, they would just curl up into a ball. Technically they're a type of cutworm, a Bertha armyworm. So they do that cutworm behavior, they curl up into a ball. Alfalfa looper just loops away when you disturb them. Diamondback moth will do its snaky dance, or it will drop on a thread.
That was John Gazlowski going back to 2013, Lindsay says. So time flies. Pretty cool. I like the dancing stuff. And we're going to watch them again. Like, it's just, see, Steph, you can see entomologists, they have fun with, like, it's hilarious. Like, it's like, oh, look at
He
this.
was totally into that. He was into that. Yeah.
He was very much so. So, Steph, from an Eastern perspective, are there any insects that you're running a sweep net for and trapping? Like, can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah. So, I mean, Jennifer would laugh at our canola acres in Ontario, probably, but so not huge acres and kind of isolated geographically. So I don't run into any canola, although the winter canola is certainly expanding throughout some more southern, warmer regions of the province. So definitely, canola is. We're gonna be learning a lot more about canola in a wider spread area of the province going forward. But we're definitely sweep netting in my area here on Perth. lot of white beans, edible beans. We're running a sweep net through them a bit later on in season, and looking for more closer when we're setting pods and things like that. Definitely running a sweep net there. So I still get my fill of the sweep net, and it's joyous. But at least there's not as many bees and stuff in the edible beans than there is in the canola. So that was always the worst part. And then Western bean cutworm, we're running trap networks and things like that for them. Probably more corn rootworm, things like that. Just trying to find out. Gosh, they drive me nuts.
Well, and what we saw in that clip with John is that, some sweeps of the net, and we see there's a lot of stuff there to sort of deal with, decipher, figure out what's good, what's bad. And it's he's going through it. I'm like, oh, what exactly is that? And I've seen some of these, videos and done some of these interviews a lot. So Jennifer, it kind of speaks to the complexity of what's happening in that canopy.
Yeah, well, and canola, I think, is one of the really spectacular ones. It's all crops are really interesting. I think alfalfa is also one of my favorites. The flowering crops, there's no question. I mean, we get so many other things in terms of pollinators coming too. But and I'm a huge fan of John's too. Always have been. The thing is, we really try and emphasize to people a sweep net, first of all, is so efficient. It's one of the cheapest tools that you'll ever buy. The pheromone traps are really pretty economically cheap too. The thing is, you need a little more expertise, and that's a-okay. And I have to say, thanks to the hundreds of people that actually deploy some of these pheromone traps and do weekly monitoring for us across the prairies and really all the way across Canada. Tremendous people who are learning how to do some of this. It's so important. But the sweep net, I tell my students every summer, you're going to expect to do 30,000 sweeps in this 4 months, because that's what it takes pretty much. And, people laugh at us, but it's one of the most effective ways to get a really quick look at what's in the canopy. And by and large, that's where most of our economic pests are usually going to be. We talked about wireworms, we talked about cutworms, and they're usually kind of lower and into the soil. But most of our major pests are in the canopy, so the sweep net is really, really important. And in pretty much every crop, we have to remember that not everything is a pest. It's really important. With the Field Heroes initiative, I'm really excited because they have some visual infographics where for canola, for wheat, and for peas, you get a sense of what kind of species might be in that crop. And the really cool thing is that we actually are starting to also train people to identify some of the beneficials. So these are like the ground beetles and some of the parasitoids. When we talk about diamondback moth, there's two super efficient parasitoids, Micropletus and Diadegma. And these parasitoids are so efficient at finding diamondback larvae. And in some of our diamondback populations that we've seen over the past few years, there's been heavy parasitism in the diamondback that actually have come to Canada and started to establish. And it's been so much so that we are ending up not necessarily having diamondback outbreak populations. So, there's a good example of a pest that has some pretty efficient parasitoids at work. But that's also where careful field scouting is really important, because, when you're starting to see diamondback, the first instinct is to manage it, right? But at the same time, when we're starting to see in the sweep net samples, it's not just diamondback larvae, we're starting to see these parasitoids. Then we can start to step back and start to really look at the numbers and apply the economic thresholds, but hopefully protect those parasitoid levels if we don't have outbreaking populations of something like diamondback. So really important that people start to learn to identify and get a good grip on what's actually in those fields, because it can have really important season-long implications.
Well, Jason points out that even canola is a pest to canola. I think he's talking about the volunteer aspect of that. Pete says sweep alfalfa for weevils, leafhoppers, and edibles, and alfalfa. And Pete also says we need a good parasitoid for swede midge and canola. That'd be a good one. Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, and I think there's a lot of work with sweet midge. There's also, remember, there's our canola flower midge that we have out here in Western Canada, and a lot of research still going into, what is the nature of that insect in canola. But yeah, I mean, there is a really good, interesting pest too that we're really hoping we don't get sweet midge established like you folks do have in Ontario, because yeah, it's not a nice one.
So, Steph, we talked about, temperature, time of day. So if you've got a client that calls you, are you looking at that field like kind of morning, noon, and night to kind of get an idea on a Wednesday what's going on, or how do you approach the scouting aspect?
Yeah, I mean, if it's 30 degrees, I want to hide in the air conditioning, obviously. So, I'm just kidding. Um,
Well, today in Lethbridge, Alberta, it is 38 degrees still at 7 o'clock at
Whoa.
night. So
Whoa.
it's warm. So yeah, I'm
It's
hiding inside
warm.
in the air conditioning. I know what you're talking.
Yeah.
Who would want to be out in a field right now?
Yeah, you deflect those ones really good. Also, Friday at 6 p.m., you deflect those ones. No. Yeah, I mean, depending on the pest, you're always kind of cutworm. We see a little bit of cutworm in our corn crop, depending in the year. And Jennifer mentioned cutworm early on in the program. Getting out at dusk or dawn and finding those ones. Otherwise, yeah, some of our major ones are not terrible from a timeline standpoint. Western meat cutworm you can get out, generally anytime. Aphids they're out there, all the time. So we get away actually pretty lucky that we can, not all the time, but we can, target most of our pests. Not too bad from a scheduling standpoint. They're always there waiting for us.
Well, Steph, you're in luck because our last clip is your favorite pest. It is Western bean cutworm. Here's clip number 3, and it is Tracy Bowdy with Omafra. Let's cue it up, Jay.
And, I want to talk about Western bean cutworm.
Yep.
A conversation you and I usually have in late June, but it's a conversation we're having July 18th.
Yep. So we're just catching for the first time Western bean cutworm moths, which are a month behind schedule, but so is the crop. So things could align here. So we're trying to get the word out.
Yeah. So talk about this season. It is backward. What does that do from a moth peak flight and impact on yield, and obviously that impact it can have on the crop?
Yeah, so growing degree days were quite delayed this year. I know the crop didn't get in because of rain, but also growing degree days were less. So the cooler nights, even though we got some hot days, the cooler nights kept the growing degree days from accumulating a lot. And that significantly impacts the development of the insect. They overwinter in the soil, so they need enough heat to get out and emerge. And it took almost a month later for them to come out and start looking.
Yeah, but they're a month late, but they may be coming.
Yes.
So from a scouting perspective, we can't drop the ball here.
No, I'm really concerned that people are going to just not bother scouting this year because they think, it's not going to be that kind of year. Well, in fact, we didn't get the crop in early enough to avoid the insects laying their eggs in the crop. So now this is going to align with pre-tassel corn right when we expect peak flight, which likely will line up around that first week of August, maybe even later. So scouting, instead of scouting now, like we normally do, it'll have to be pushed back to maybe the last week of July into August this year to make sure we're catching them.
Quick review, when we're out scouting, what are we looking for?
You're looking for eggs. Obviously a trap by the field really helps tell you what the population's doing in your immediate area. Then focus on the field, that's more ideal. So it will be that pre-tassel, as long as there's a tassel in that whirl, to when the tassel's fully out, not quite spent yet. That's what the mom is looking for to lay her eggs in. Then scout for 3 weeks in a row. If you find in 100 plants that you're looking at, five of those plants, whether it's 1 week or within those 3 weeks, you've reached threshold, that 5% threshold. So then you'd need to spray.
Yeah. So we've reached threshold.
Yeah.
What are our control options from a spray perspective?
Yep. So you've got 4 options. There's Coragen, there's Matador, but I'd caution using Matador in heat. There is Delegate, and there's Volume Express, which is a combination of the Coragen and Matador. A lot of people love using Coragen, and I'm really concerned. We've had area-wide use in some regions of Coragen. I want to caution that they rotate out of that this year and use a different product, because resistance, this pest can develop resistance. It has to one of the cry proteins in the transgenic Bt corn. It can do the same with foliar insecticides. So rotate annually what you've used on this pest.
That video was from 2019. Good stuff. Steph, does that make you shudder a little bit?
Yeah, it does. It does. Peter's comment, like trying to find those egg masses is it's literally like trying to find a needle in a haystack. You're looking for a dime size egg mass on a corn plant. And we planted 34,000 plants per acre, and you have to find 5 of these things. Like it's I feel for Tracy and Ag Canada entomologists trying to develop guidelines for this, because it's we're doing the best we can, but gosh, it's hard to find them.
Yeah, what's the threshold then? Like how many of
so
those
like Tracy,
masses do you have to find?
Sorry, Tracy mentioned it there in the video. Out of 100 plants, if you're finding five egg masses cumulatively, and that's I think was the biggest learning we've had in the last couple of years. First, we had 5%, right? Five. If you find 5, you're there. But we'd keep going back. We'd find 1, and then we'd find 2, and it's if you find 5 over that couple peak flight week windows, and we're so it's getting to be a little bit easier, but it's still hard. I find more often than not, I have fields where I don't find any egg masses, and then I come back and it's polluted with larvae. And it's like I said, you're trying to find a needle in a haystack, and it's easier to find the larvae once they're feeding on the cobs, because they're big worms, right? So it's too late at that point. The damage is done.
We got a question here. We're almost out of time. We're going to squeeze a few more questions in here, sort of like agronomist lightning round. Farmer Schneck asks, what's the best source for an economic threshold for spider mites in soybeans? What about the spot spray versus field-wide spray once the decision to go is made? Steph, you want to handle that one?
Yeah, that is, I saw that question earlier. That's a really good question, because that's one where there isn't a really good app, and there really isn't a good guideline for it. It's really tough. It's based on gut and stress, and how's the crop doing, and it's one of those ones like Jennifer mentioned earlier that we get 2 inches of rain, and guys ask that, well, it'll wash it off the plants. No, but it'll take the stress off of the plants. We see spider mites hot and dry, and the plants can tolerate a certain amount, and they're way too tiny to visually see. You need a hand lens, right? So you're not counting the number of spider mites, but a rain can take the stress off the plants that can tolerate the spider mites for that much longer. So it's not one where a 2-inch rain will cure it, but it definitely takes the action threshold to a different level. There is no good source, Warren. I'm sorry. It's definitely a gut feel, and when the crop is stressed during those reproductive stages, that's when I'm pulling the trigger at a certain point. And spot spraying versus the whole field, it's totally real with those pests. Spider mites are localized, and a lot of times they move in on the edge of field. So there has been times where we shut down the infestation by just doing the outer round, and keeping them at bay in the outer round. And a great example of IPM not treating the whole field when you can visually see the stress in the outer round.
Well, here on the Agronomists every week, we seem to always find like sayings that people use and rules to live by. There was like if the soil's fit, give her shit. Like there's been a whole bunch of stuff that's happened. We got a good one here from Jason. He says, never trust a pale agronomist. Words to live by. Jennifer, a question here from Pete. This was a question earlier from Paul, and Pete's reminded me. Is there any way to make the plant healthier to ward off insect attacks?
Oh, so my husband is an agronomist, so I rely on a lot of suggestions. It's all about getting good stands, and I think we too often overlook some of these things, that the basics of just getting plants in and getting them healthy and growing is really pretty critical. Healthy plants and good growing conditions, that's $1 million equation. Some of our insect pests, managing them, yeah, that's really important. But at the same time, absolutely, I think I've looked at some stands that are just under such stress, pastures sometimes with cutworm damage, and it's not just the cutworms, it's the fact that unfortunately that pasture's been overgrazed. It's super dry and hot. It's just not getting the moisture. Stand health really does matter. And I think even as entomologists, we all recognize that healthy plants are like so fundamental, and it really is what we're trying to protect and grow. So, I defer to any agronomist because, seeding rates, choosing the right cultivars, getting your fertilizer packages ready, managing your weeds appropriately. All these things contribute and make really strong stands. With wheat midge, one of the things we see is that when the stand is going and flowering at a nice synchronous stage, rather than flowering over weeks and weeks and weeks, well, that's a perfect recipe because there's plants available to wheat midge for a much longer period. Whereas if we get nice healthy stands that are pretty uniform and really pushing themselves along, that really is a best case scenario to be trying to manage insect infestations on top of it. So yeah, do what you can to grow healthy plants.
Well, and we talked about canola and flea beetles earlier. Look at a couple of years ago with the hail, kept on knocking that canola back, and the flea beetles kept on punishing those plants because they couldn't get out in front of them, right? So that's probably a really good example that comes to mind. One of the things that Tracy had said in that video was about, and I can't remember what the product was, but reliance on certain insecticides. Steph, how do you coach growers in terms of, we hear a lot about herbicide rotation. What about insecticide rotation? What is there anything to that?
Yeah, I see Jennifer's nodding along there too.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
I mean, there seems to be, certain reasons why certain people pick, the pesticides they do, but it is exactly, Shaun, you hit the nail on the head. Like herbicide rotation, the mixing up modes of action is more important now than ever. And I think it's more important now as we're seeing these pests year after year after year, right? We're using some of these insecticides every single year in multiple crops. We need to be rotating them hugely, and it does come into the discussion. Unfortunately, sometimes cost comes into that discussion too, right? And that can be that barrier. So, there's reasons for all these decisions, but Tracy is very accurate in saying that we need to be switching those up.
Hey, Steph, I'm going to slide one last one in here. Farmer Schneck asks, keep hearing about herbicide shortages. How are insecticides doing in the supply chain? Have you heard anything?
No, insecticides are generally a tougher one because, either sometimes we don't have a terrible bug year and, there's not a huge pressure on the supply chain for insecticides. And then there's other years where, all of a sudden there's a spider mite and an aphid outbreak and you can't find the insecticides enough. So far indications have been pretty no concerns from that standpoint, Warren, but, we are certainly watching it and we'll be getting product in place. In like our area, we've gotten a lot of rain, so I'm not really that super concerned about spider mites or aphids at this time because we've had good moisture. The plants aren't stressed, so I'm not bringing in a pile of insecticide at this time. But some dry areas certainly are looking at bringing in some product. Yeah.
Jennifer, question here from Jason: are we creating resistance in flea beetles with all the spraying we are doing?
Oh man, that's a good question, and I worry about it. A lot of acres are, first of all, treated with seed treatments, right? And we know that there's some good and bad in terms of some of those products working really well against striped flea beetles versus crucifer flea beetles. I also know that some people, when they're buying their seed treatment, there's also linked to maybe having to do some foliar. So I think what really concerns me, it's just like Steph's saying, when we're talking about a short list of insecticides that keep being used on same acres, but also when we start to look at like a larger land area. I mean, we see canola up here, it's canola for miles, right? Sometimes it's the same grower even for some of our big fields, right? But, you know, when they're managing that kind of land area with a very limited number of products, the writing is on the wall and we've seen it. You know, we now also are starting to look at some other insect pests like alfalfa weevil in southern Alberta that's maybe showing some real evidence of insecticide resistance. It happens. I think the thing is we have short memories and some of these insects take longer to build up. We are super lucky to live in a temperate climate because, you know, even our climate is hard on these insects, but people need to remember in the United States, in southern United States, Lygus is resistant to several different types of insecticide. And it's because of the constant repetitive use and, you know, the fact that they have constant growing season. So yeah, I mean, manage things, rotate. Crop rotation is really critical. I should have mentioned that too about growing good crops because, you know, canola on canola, the peas is notorious for that. We're starting to see less and less of that. But, you know, just thinking about how you're managing your land area and making smart decisions with registered products, it's a real gamble, I know, and a lot to juggle, but that's really what's critical.
Okay, great stuff. I always say we have a hard stop at quarter after. I better stick to that, although we could go for a long time here. But I really do appreciate everybody's questions tonight, their comments, also our panelists. Steph Berlett, thank you so much from the Agromart Group for joining us here tonight.
Thanks, Shaun.
And I apologize for the screw up on the last name at the beginning, so forgive me.
I knew who you meant.
Yeah. Also, Jennifer Otani from AFC out of Beaverlodge, Alberta. Jennifer, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I want to remind everybody that you can get CCA credits for attending tonight's show. Go to realagriculture.com and get signed up for our Agronomist newsletter, and we'll tell you how to do all of that. And love everybody joining in here. This is a great community building here every Monday night, 8 o'clock Eastern, 6 o'clock Mountain. Lots of familiar faces and names in the chat. And it's really, really great to see. And I hope everybody out there is having a decent growing season. I know there's some challenging areas. There are some good spots as well. Biggest thing is a lot of areas hoping for some more rain for sure. But some did come last week, and hopefully there's more on its way. So, hey, thanks everybody for getting real and getting connected with the Agronomists, and we'll see you again next week. Cheers, everybody.